The water was rising too fast. Rebecca Harrison never imagined she would wake up at 3 in the morning with icy water, invading her ground floor bedroom in her home in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. If you want to find out how this story ends, leave your like now, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any detail of this emotional journey. Your interaction makes all the difference. Rebecca woke to the sound of something breaking downstairs. Her husband James was already up, staring out the bedroom window with an expression she had never seen before. It was pure fear. The rain had been pounding the roof for 3 consecutive days, but no one expected the Cedar River to overflow with such violence. Authorities had issued a voluntary evacuation warning the previous night, but James thought they were exaggerating. Cedar Rapids had a flood control system built after the 2008 disaster. They would be safe, or so he thought. The water already completely covered First Avenue when Rebecca ran down the stairs. The wooden floor was slippery, and furniture floated through the living room like drifting boats. The refrigerator had toppled over, and the couch where Ethan used to watch cartoons was half submerged. The wall clock still worked, showing 3:15 a.m. Rebecca felt panic tighten her chest. Ethan, where was Ethan? She ran to her son's bedroom down the ground floor hallway. The door was ajar, and the water was already up to her knees. Ethan was standing on the bed, clutching his teddy bear to his chest, his eyes wide with terror. He was only 8 years old, too young to understand what was happening, too young to know that his life was in real danger. Rebecca grabbed her son in her arms and carried him back to the stairs. James was already gathering essential items into a waterproof backpack: documents, cash, cell phones, chargers. He worked as a manager at a car dealership on Interstate 380, a practical man who always had a plan. But at that moment, even he looked lost. The TV in the living room was still working despite the water. On the local news, the KCRG TV9 reporter said that the Cedar River had reached historic levels, surpassing even the catastrophic 2008 flood. More than 15,000 homes were in immediate danger. Rescue teams were overwhelmed. Helicopters couldn't fly because of the storm. People were on their own. James made a quick decision. They had to leave immediately. The car was in the garage at Toyota RAV4. He had bought the previous year specifically because of its high ground clearance. If they could make it to Interstate 380 and head north, they could reach higher ground in Hiawatha. His mother's house was there, in an elevated area that would surely be safe. Rebecca dressed Ethan in dry clothes she'd grabbed from upstairs: jeans, a hoodie, sneakers. She threw on whatever she could find quickly. There was no time to think about comfort or appearance. There was only time to survive. The garage was completely flooded when they opened the door connecting it to the house. The water was up to Rebecca's waist, dark, cold, filled with debris floating on the surface. Pieces of wood, plastic packaging, jugs of chemicals that had been stored on the shelves. The smell was terrible, a mix of motor oil, mold, and sewage. James opened the car door and put Rebecca and Ethan in the back seat. The engine started on the first try, a small miracle amid the chaos. He pressed the remote for the garage door, and it slowly rose, revealing an apocalyptic sight outside. The street had become a raging river. Abandoned cars floated sideways, tilted lampposts cast distorted shadows over the water, and the rain kept falling, relentless. James hit the gas. The RAV4 pushed through the water, the tires spinning before finding traction. He turned right on 10th Avenue, heading toward the interstate. The water was higher than he expected, reaching almost to the car's hood. The engine coughed, sputtered, but kept running. Rebecca held Ethan tightly, whispering words of comfort. She didn't believe herself. "It's going to be okay, sweetheart. We're almost there. Daddy knows what he's doing." Interstate 380 was only 12 blocks away, but it felt like miles. Every street they crossed was worse than the last. On 8th Avenue, a white van floated past them, completely empty, like a ghost ship. On 6th, there was a family on the roof of a 2-story house, waving desperately to anyone who could see them. James hesitated for a moment, but Rebecca said what he was thinking. "We can't help. If we stop, we'll die too." It was on 3rd Avenue that everything fell apart. A massive wave, formed by the collapse of an improvised dam upriver, swept through the street like a wall of liquid concrete. Rebecca saw the water coming before she felt the impact. It was brown and foamy, carrying entire trees, parts of houses, a trailer spinning wildly. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the deafening roar. The wave slammed into the side of the car with brutal force. The RAV4 was lifted off the ground like a toy. Rebecca's stomach flipped as the vehicle rolled onto its side. Glass shattered, metal groaned. And then there was only water pouring in from all sides, icy and merciless. Rebecca held on to Ethan with all her strength, but the water was stronger. She felt her fingers slipping from her son's jacket. No. She tried to scream, but water filled her mouth, her lungs. She saw Ethan being torn from her arms, saw his eyes wide with terror, saw his small hands reaching for her, and then he disappeared into the dark water. Rebecca didn't know how she reached the surface. Her lungs burned, her body was numb from the cold, but she was alive. She clung to a piece of wall floating nearby, gasping, coughing up water. She screamed Ethan's name until her voice was raw. She screamed for James, she screamed for help. But there was only the sound of rain and rushing water. A National Guard helicopter found her 3 hours later, hanging from a partially submerged tree near First Avenue, barely conscious from hypothermia. They hoisted her onto a stretcher and took her to the evacuation center at Veterans Memorial Stadium, where hundreds of people were gathered, wrapped in silver thermal blankets, staring blankly into space. Rebecca regained consciousness in the improvised medical center. A nurse, with kind but tired eyes, was checking her vitals. Early pneumonia, moderate hypothermia, bruises all over her body, but she was alive. The first thing Rebecca asked about was Ethan. The nurse looked away. "We're still looking, dear. Many people are still missing. Don't lose hope." James had been found an hour before Rebecca, clinging to the wreckage of the car 2 kilometers from where the wave had hit them. He had a fractured left arm and a deep gash on his forehead that needed 17 stitches. When Rebecca saw him in the medical center, something in his eyes was broken. He couldn't look at her directly. The guilt was a physical presence between them, heavy and suffocating. For the next 3 days, Rebecca didn't sleep. She searched every temporary shelter in Cedar Rapids, the Veterans Memorial Stadium, the First Avenue Methodist Church, the Washington High School gym, the public library whose second floor was still above water. She carried a photo of Ethan printed on plain paper, now smudged and crumpled from being shown so many times. Blonde hair, brown eyes, a smile with 2 missing front teeth, 8 years old. He was wearing a blue hoodie with the Iowa Hawkeyes logo. "Please, has anyone seen my son?" Rescue teams had recovered 17 bodies so far. Rebecca was required to see each one, just to be sure. None of them were Ethan. She didn't know if that was a relief or an additional torture. Part of her wanted to know, wanted certainty, wanted to begin the process of mourning. But another part, the part that was still a mother, still had hope. On the morning of the 4th day, a call came into the emergency command center. A boy had been found alive in an improvised structure on the banks of the Cedar River, about 14 miles south of Cedar Rapids, near the small town of Bertram. Blonde hair, 8 years old, wearing a blue Hawkeyes sweatshirt. He was dehydrated and scared, but alive. Rebecca doesn't remember the drive to Bertram. A Red Cross volunteer took her in a Ford pickup that swerved around fallen trees and sections of Highway 30 that had been completely washed away by the flood. All she saw through the window was destruction, roofless houses, collapsed barns, farmlands turned into lakes. The flood had rewritten the geography of eastern Iowa. The shelter where Ethan was staying was an old barn belonging to a retired farming family. The building sat on a small rise that had escaped the worst of the flooding. There were about 30 people there, mostly elderly, who hadn't been able to evacuate in time. Volunteers handed out bottled water and peanut butter sandwiches. Ethan was sitting in a corner, wrapped in a red blanket, drinking apple juice from a box. When he saw Rebecca, his face lit up. "Mom," he ran to her, and Rebecca grabbed him in her arms, holding him so tightly she feared she might hurt him. She cried then, for the first time since the flood. Cried from relief, gratitude, emotional exhaustion. When she finally managed to compose herself, Rebecca examined Ethan carefully. Scratches on his arms, a bruise on his shoulder, but nothing serious. "How are you alive?" she asked, holding his face in her hands. "How did you get here?" "The man saved me," Ethan said simply. "He pulled me out of the water." Rebecca looked around the shelter. "What man, sweetheart? Where is he?" A nearby volunteer overheard the conversation. "The man who brought your son?" "Ma'am, he left about an hour ago. Didn't want to stay. Said he had other people to look for." Rebecca felt something tighten in her chest. She needed to find this man. She needed to thank him. She needed to know how Ethan had survived. "What does he look like?" she asked. "Did you get his name?" The volunteer shook her head. "He didn't give a name. Tall, I think, with a beard, worn clothes, like he lived outdoors. He seemed to know the river very well, knew exactly where to look for survivors." Ethan tugged on Rebecca's sleeve. "He was nice, Mom. He gave me food, and he told me stories while we waited." "What kind of stories?" Rebecca asked, curious about us. Ethan said, "He knew about Grandma. He knew where we live. He even knew you liked to plant roses in the garden." Rebecca's blood ran cold. How could a stranger know those details? She turned to the volunteer. "Which way did he go?" The woman pointed toward a trail leading back to the river. "He said something about a camp near Sutliff Bridge. But I wouldn't recommend going there alone, ma'am. That area's not safe yet." But Rebecca was already going. She took Ethan's hand and walked in the direction the woman had indicated. The trail was muddy and full of fallen branches, but she didn't care. Every step brought her closer to answers. The Sutliff Bridge was an old wooden and steel structure that had crossed the Cedar River for more than 100 years. The flood had severely damaged one end, but the bridge still stood, stubbornly resisting the force of the water. Rebecca saw smoke rising from somewhere near the riverbank below the bridge. She carefully descended the steep slope. There was a small flat area there, protected from the floodwaters by large rocks forming a natural barrier. And in the middle of that area was an improvised Camp Green military tent, a fire pit surrounded by stones, clothes drying on a line stretched between 2 trees, and a man. He was facing away from her, feeding the fire with dry branches. He was tall, as the volunteer had said, with broad shoulders under a faded flannel jacket. dark hair, shoulder length, streaked with gray at the sides. A thick beard hid most of his face. Rebecca stopped a few meters away. "Hello," she called. The man froze for a moment. Then, slowly, he turned around. Rebecca felt the world tilt beneath her feet. She knew that face. She knew it even under the beard, even under the years and the wear of time. She knew those green eyes identical to hers. She knew the scar above his left eyebrow from when he'd fallen off his bike at 9. She knew the way he tilted his head slightly to the right when nervous. "Michael," she whispered. Her brother, who had disappeared 20 years ago. Her brother, who everyone thought was dead. Her brother whom she had searched for in every police report, every hospital record, every missing person photo for years until she finally gave up. He was there, alive, looking at her with an expression of shock to something else, something that looked like pain. "Hi, Becca," Michael said, using the nickname no one else had called her in decades. And Rebecca didn't know whether to hug him or scream at him. She didn't know whether to cry in relief or rage. All she knew was that the man who had saved her son was the brother she had lost so long ago, and nothing in her life would ever make sense again. Rebecca stood frozen, unable to move, as 20 years of pain, anger, and unanswered questions collided in her mind. Michael seemed equally paralyzed, his hand still holding the stick he was about to place in the fire. The Cedar River kept flowing behind them, indifferent to the impossible moment unfolding on its banks. Ethan broke the silence. "Mom, do you know him?" The boy's voice brought Rebecca back to reality. She looked at her son, then at Michael, trying to process the impossibility of the situation. "Yes, sweetheart," she finally said, her voice coming out weaker than she intended. "I know him. He's my brother." Michael dropped the stick and took a step back, as if Rebecca's words were a physical blow. "I didn't know," he said quickly, his voice rough from disuse. "When I found him in the water, I didn't know who he was. I swear, Becca, I didn't know he was your son." Rebecca felt hot tears stream down her face. 20 years, Michael. 20 years without a word. Mom died thinking you were dead. Dad died looking for you, and you were here the whole time. Michael shook his head slowly. "Not here the whole time. I moved around a lot, but yes, in Iowa. Always in Iowa." He looked at the river, unable to meet Rebecca's eyes. "I couldn't come back, Becca. After what happened, I just couldn't." "What happened?" The words hung between them like an accusation. Rebecca knew the official story, the version the family had built over the years to make sense of the inexplicable. Michael was 19 when he disappeared. He had had a violent argument with their father about his decision to drop out of college, about the bad company he was keeping, about money that had disappeared from the family's bank account. The fight ended with Michael leaving home on his old Honda motorcycle, promising never to return, and he kept that promise. The police found the motorcycle 3 days later, abandoned in a parking lot near Palisades Kepler State Park, about 9 miles south of Cedar Rapids. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence of a crime. Michael had simply vanished. Searches were conducted, posters were put up. The story appeared in the Cedar Rapids Gazette, but Michael was never found. Eventually, the family had to accept one of two possibilities. Either Michael was dead, the victim of some accident or crime that was never uncovered, or he had chosen to disappear, to start a new life away from them. Rebecca's mother, Catherine, never accepted the second option. She died of pancreatic cancer 7 years ago, still keeping a room intact for Michael, still waiting for him to come home. Rebecca's father, Thomas, had been consumed by the search. He spent thousands of dollars hiring private investigators, following leads that never went anywhere. He drove through Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin, stopping in every small town to show Michael's pictures at gas stations and diners, the search to find him, and when he died of a heart attack 4 years ago, Rebecca was sure it was as much from heartbreak as from illness. And here was Michael, alive, less than 20 miles from where they had grown up. Rebecca took a step toward her brother. "You need to explain to me," she said, her voice trembling between anger and desperation. "You owe me at least that. You owe it to Mom and Dad. You owe it to that 16-year-old girl who lost her big brother and never understood why." Michael finally looked at her, and Rebecca saw tears in his green eyes. "I know," he whispered. "I know what I did. I live with it every day." "Then tell me," Rebecca insisted. "Tell me why." Michael looked at Ethan, who was watching the exchange wide-eyed. "Maybe we should sit down," he said. "This is going to take a while." They sat around the fire, Ethan nestled beside Rebecca, Michael on the other side of the flames. The warmth was welcome after the damp cold that clung to everything after the flood. Michael took a thermos and poured hot chocolate into 3 dented metal mugs. He handed one to Ethan, another to Rebecca. "The fight with Dad," Michael began, "wasn't about dropping out of college. I mean, it was, but there was much more behind it." He paused, stirring the embers with a stick. "I was in trouble, Becca, serious trouble." "What kind of trouble?" Michael took a deep breath. "I owed money to the wrong people, dangerous people. I had started playing poker at a place in Iowa City, thinking I could make easy money. At first, I did. I won a lot, but then the luck turned, and I kept playing, trying to win it back. Classic rookie mistake." He took a sip of his hot chocolate before continuing. Eventually, I owed $15,000 to a guy named Vincent Russo. Russo had connections with people in Chicago, people who didn't take excuses or promises. They wanted the money, or they wanted blood. Simple as that. Rebecca felt her stomach tighten. The money that disappeared from our parents' account. Michael nodded miserably. I took $8,000. That's all I could withdraw without raising immediate flags. I thought I could put it back before anyone noticed, but Dad checked that account religiously. He found out in 2 days. Hence the fight. Michael confirmed. He demanded to know what I needed the money for. I couldn't tell the truth. If he knew about the gambling, the debts, the kind of people who were after me, he would have tried to fix it. And knowing Dad, he would have confronted Russo directly. Russo would have killed him, Becca, without hesitation. So you ran away, Rebecca said, understanding slowly taking shape. I had no choice, Michael said, his voice laden with pent-up emotion. Russo gave me 48 hours to come up with the rest of the money. I had no way to get $7,000 in 2 days, so I did the only thing I could do. I disappeared. Rebecca processed this in silence. You could have gone to the police. Michael let out a bitter laugh, and said what? That I was being threatened by a loan shark? They would have laughed at me. Or worse, they would have arrested me for stealing from my own parents. And even if they took me seriously, Russo had cops in his pocket. I would have ended up dead in a cell. Ethan had fallen asleep, leaning against Rebecca, exhausted by the events of the past few days. She gently stroked her son's hair as she looked at Michael through the flames. So, you just vanished. Left all of us thinking you were dead. Michael wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. I thought it would be easier that way. If I simply disappeared, Russo would eventually give up, and you could move on. Mourn and move on. But we didn't move on, Rebecca said, her voice gaining strength. Mom never moved on. She kept your room exactly as you left it until the day she died. Dad spent every cent we had looking for you. He died still searching, Michael, and I grew up without my older brother, without understanding why you abandoned us. Michael covered his face with his hands. I know, he said, his voice muffled. I know, and I'm sorry. God, Becca, I'm so sorry, but I couldn't come back. Even after Russo stopped looking for me, even after I learned he had moved to Nevada years later, I couldn't come back. How could I look you in the eye after what I did? How could I explain that I stayed away while Mom got sick, while Dad destroyed himself searching for me? You could have tried, Rebecca said harshly. You should have tried. They sat in silence for a long moment, only the crackling of the fire and the distant sound of the river filling the space between them. Finally, Rebecca asked the question that was burning in her mind. How did you live all these years? Michael looked around his small camp. I made do. At first it was hard. I slept in shelters, worked odd jobs, paid in cash, construction, farm work, anything that didn't require proper identification. Eventually, I settled here, near the river. He gestured to the landscape around them. I know every mile of the Cedar River from Waterloo to Muscatine. I live off the land. I fish. I do occasional jobs for local farmers. It's not a comfortable life, but it's a life. And you never wanted more? Rebecca asked. Never wanted a house, a family, a normal life? Michael looked directly at her. Every day, he said simply. Every day for 20 years. Rebecca felt her anger begin to mix with something more complicated. Compassion, perhaps, or at least understanding. She could see the cost Michael's choice had exacted. He was only 39, but he looked 50. His face was marked by time, his skin hardened by years of exposure to the elements. His hands were rough and calloused, his nails permanently dirty. He had paid a price for his survival, even if it was different from the price the family had paid. How did you find Ethan? She finally asked. Michael leaned back, looking up at the sky that was slowly brightening as dawn approached. I was at my camp when the flood began. I know the signs, the patterns of the water. I knew it would be bad, so I moved to higher ground. But I also knew people would die. People always die in floods because they wait too long to evacuate, or because they make the wrong decisions in a panic. He looked at the sleeping Ethan. I spent 2 days paddling along the river in my kayak, searching for survivors. I found a few, an elderly lady clinging to a fence, a family on a roof. I took them to shelters, then went back to look for more. That's how I found your son. Michael paused, the memory clearly difficult for him. He was unconscious, caught in some branches about 2 miles downstream from where you probably lost him. The water was carrying him away, but the branches held him. A few more minutes and he would have drowned or died of hypothermia. Rebecca pulled Ethan closer, silent tears running down her face. I pulled him into the kayak and took him to the shore. Michael continued. He was cold, very cold, but he was breathing. I built a fire, took off his wet clothes, wrapped him in my sleeping bag. It took an hour for him to wake up. When he woke, he was terrified, crying out for you, for someone named James. My husband, Rebecca said softly. He survived too. Michael nodded. I stayed with the boy until he calmed down. I gave him food. I tried to keep him warm and distracted. He told me about his family. He told me about you. He paused, a strange expression crossing his face. He said his mother loved planting roses, that she always planted red roses in the front yard. Rebecca felt a chill run down her spine. Mom taught me, she whispered. It was hers, the passion for roses. I know, Michael said. I remember watching you two in the garden together when you were little. I remember how your eyes lit up when the first flowers bloomed in the spring. He cleared his throat. When Ethan mentioned the roses, I started to suspect. Then he mentioned that your family lived on 10th Avenue in Cedar Rapids. And he described the house. Our old house, Becca. The house where we grew up? You still live there? Michael asked in disbelief. Rebecca nodded. James and I bought it from our parents 5 years ago, when they wanted to downsize. After Dad died, I couldn't let it go. There were too many memories, good and bad. Michael rubbed his face, clearly moved. When I realized I had saved my sister's son, our parents' grandson, I almost told him who I was. But then I thought of you. I thought about what it would be like for you to find out I was alive after all these years. I thought it would be kinder to let you think it was a stranger who saved your son. But you knew I would come looking for you, Rebecca said. You knew I wouldn't rest until I found out who saved Ethan. Michael gave a sad smile. I knew you when you were 16, Becca, so stubborn, so determined. I figured you probably hadn't changed much. He looked at her across the fire. Was I right? Rebecca couldn't help a small smile. Some things don't change. The sun was rising now, casting golden light over the river and the devastation the flood had left behind. Rebecca could see the extent of the damage for the first time. Uprooted trees, debris scattered as far as the eye could see. The Suttliff Bridge, badly damaged but still standing, a stubborn testament to engineering from another century. What happens now? Michael asked quietly. Rebecca looked at her brother, at the man he had become during his absence. She thought of her mother, who would never know Michael was alive. She thought of her father, who died searching. She thought of all the birthdays Michael missed, all the Christmases, all the milestones and disappointments of life that should have been shared. 20 years could not be reclaimed. 20 years of pain could not be erased with explanations, no matter how valid. But she also thought of Ethan, sleeping safely in her arms thanks to this man, her brother. Her brother who had faced impossible choices at 19 and made the wrong decision for reasons that seemed right at the time. I don't know, she finally admitted. This is too big, Michael, too complicated. I need time to process all of this. Michael nodded, understanding and something like relief in his eyes. I understand. I don't expect forgiveness. Becca, I don't deserve it, but I wanted you to know the truth. You deserve at least that. Rebecca stood carefully, holding Ethan in her arms. The boy mumbled, but didn't wake, too exhausted to care about being moved. Where will you be? She asked. If I decide I want to talk more, how do I find you? Michael gestured toward his camp. I'll be here. I'm always here. The river is my home now. Rebecca looked around at the battered tent, at the few possessions Michael had accumulated over 2 decades of life on the banks. It was a lonely, almost monastic existence, a self-imposed penance for real and imagined scenes. You don't have to live like this, she said softly. Russo is gone. The threats are gone. You could return to the world. Michael shook his head. The world has no place for someone who's been dead for 20 years. I have no documents, no work history, no identity other than this. He gestured to himself. This is who I am now. It doesn't have to be, Rebecca insisted. There are lawyers, there are processes. You could be declared alive again. You could rebuild. Maybe, Michael said, but he didn't sound convinced. One day at a time, Becca. Just one day at a time. Rebecca began to climb back up the bank to the trail. She stopped and looked back. Michael was feeding the fire again, already returning to the routine of his isolated life. He looked so small there, so lost, so completely alone. Michael, she called. He looked up. Thank you, she said, for saving my son. Whatever happens, whatever I decide about all this. Thank you for saving Ethan. Michael nodded, unable to speak. Rebecca saw tears streaming down his bearded face as he quickly turned away. She carried Ethan back along the trail, her thoughts spinning. The flood had taken so much from her, her home, her possessions, her sense of security, but it had also given back something she thought was lost forever. Her brother, complicated, wounded, full of regret and guilt, but alive. When she got back to the shelter in Bertram, James was there, frantically looking for her. His arm was in a cast, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. Where were you? He demanded, relief and anger mixing in his voice. I was worried something had happened to you. Rebecca looked at her husband, at the man with whom she had built a life, who had survived the same flood that had nearly killed them. She needed to tell him. She needed to tell someone, or she would explode under the weight of it. I found who saved Ethan, she said calmly. James waited, clearly not understanding why this was so significant. It was Michael, Rebecca said, the words coming out in a whisper. My brother. He's alive. James? He's been alive this whole time. James stared at her, shock draining the color from his face. That's impossible, he finally said. I know, Rebecca replied. But it's true. I saw him. I talked to him. It's him, James. It's really him. James pulled Rebecca and Ethan into an awkward hug with his good arm. My God, he whispered. My God, Becca, how is that possible? And as they stood there together, a family reunited by tragedy and by miracle, Rebecca told her husband everything. About the gambling, about the debts, about the impossible choices a 19-year-old had made, about 20 years of self-imposed isolation, about a man who had become a ghost in his own life. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. The first rays of true sunlight in almost a week broke through the clouds, illuminating the devastation the flood had caused. Cedar Rapids had a long road to recovery. Lives had been lost, homes destroyed, communities shattered. But amid the destruction, something impossible had happened. A brother had been found. A family had been reunited, even if in a fragile and incomplete way. And as Rebecca held her son and her husband, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, something good could come from all this. The future was uncertain. The questions were many. But for now, in this moment, they were alive. And that would have to be enough. The days following the flood were a blur of frantic activity. Cedar Rapids was in full recovery mode. The National Guard still patrolled the flooded streets. Helicopters flew overhead constantly, and FEMA trucks arrived loaded with emergency supplies. The mayor had declared a state of disaster, and the governor of Iowa visited in person, promising federal resources for rebuilding. Rebecca and James were temporarily staying at James's mother's house in Hiawatha, a modest colonial structure on a quiet street called Robbins Road. The house had escaped the flood entirely, situated on ground high enough to be safe. Margaret Harrison, a 62-year-old woman with gray hair and kind eyes, had insisted they stay as long as they needed. She had plenty of space since her husband had passed away 3 years earlier. Ethan seemed to be recovering well physically. A doctor at the evacuation center had examined him thoroughly and declared him surprisingly unharmed, considering his ordeal. A few scratches, minor bruises, but nothing time wouldn't heal. Psychologically, however, was another story. The boy woke up screaming every night, dreaming of dark water and being pulled away from his mother. He refused to take a bath alone, panicking whenever he saw water filling the tub. James had returned to work earlier than he should have. His dealership on Interstate 380 desperately needing all available staff. Many of the vehicles on the lot had been destroyed by the flood, and there was a mountain of insurance claims to process. He left at 7 in the morning and rarely returned before 9 at night, exhausted and stressed, which meant Rebecca had a lot of time to think. A lot of time to process the impossible revelation that had changed everything. Michael was alive. Her brother was alive, and she was the only person in the world who knew. She hadn't told her mother. She hadn't told the few friends who called to check on her. She had made James promise to keep the secret until she decided what to do. And James, to his credit, agreed, although she could see he found the situation unsustainable. On the 4th day after finding Michael, Rebecca made a decision. She needed to see him again. She needed deeper answers than he had given. She needed to understand not just why he had left, but why he had stayed away for so long. His explanations had made sense on the surface, but the more she thought about them, the more questions arose. She waited until Margaret took Ethan to an appointment with a child therapist who was offering free services to flood survivors. Then she borrowed Margaret's Honda Accord and drove back to Bertram, back to the Suttliff Bridge, back to Michael's camp. The road was in terrible condition. Highway 30 had entire sections washed out, forcing Rebecca to detour along rural roads she barely recognized. Fields that should have been prepared for spring planting were submerged under murky brown water. Barns had collapsed. Houses were marked with an orange spray-painted X, indicating they had been checked by search and rescue teams. It took nearly 2 hours to make a trip that would normally take 40 minutes. When Rebecca finally reached the area near the Suttliff Bridge, she parked on the roadside and walked the rest of the way. The trail was even muddier than before, but she navigated it carefully, her sneakers sinking into the thick brown muck. Michael's camp was exactly as she remembered it. The green tent, the fire pit, the clothes drying. But Michael wasn't there. Rebecca called his name, but only the sound of the river answered. She waited 20 minutes, then decided to explore a bit. That's when she noticed the second tent, smaller, hidden behind a cluster of bushes, and beside it, an improvised gravestone made of stacked stones. Rebecca approached slowly, her heart speeding up. The stones formed a small marker, and tucked between them was a laminated photograph, discolored by time and the elements. Rebecca leaned closer and felt her breath catch. It was a photo of their family, the whole family. Thomas and Catherine Harrison sitting on the floral couch in their living room. Michael standing behind them, 19 years old, smiling broadly, and Rebecca, 16, beside her brother, wearing the blue dress her mother had bought for Michael's high school graduation photos. Rebecca remembered when that photo had been taken. 2 weeks before Michael disappeared, her mother had insisted on hiring a professional photographer, saying they needed an updated family photo. Michael had complained about having to wear a suit, but eventually agreed. It was the last photo they had all together. Tears burned in Rebecca's eyes as she touched the image. Michael had kept this. He had created a memorial for the family he had abandoned. For the parents he never saw again. For the sister he left behind. "You found my little shrine." Rebecca turned quickly. Michael was standing at the edge of the camp, holding 2 fish on a line. He looked tired, older than when she had last seen him. "I didn't know you'd be here," he said, walking closer. Usually no one comes. Rebecca pointed to the improvised gravestone. What is this? Michael set the fish in a bucket of ice near the fire before answering. It's my way of remembering. My way of keeping you close. He looked at the photo. I took it out of my wallet before leaving my motorcycle in that parking lot. I thought that if the police found the bike with my wallet still in it, it would seem more likely that something bad had happened to me, that I hadn't simply run away. You staged your own death, Rebecca said, horror and understanding mixing in her voice. I made it easier for people to think I was dead, Michael corrected. Not the same thing, isn't it? Rebecca challenged. You abandoned your motorcycle, left your wallet, disappeared without a trace. What else were we supposed to think? Michael sat heavily on a log near the fire. I didn't think it through, he admitted. I was 19, Becca. I was terrified. I had people threatening to kill me if I didn't pay a debt I had no way to pay. I panicked. You had 20 years to fix it, Rebecca said, her voice rising. 20 years. Michael. At some point during those 2 decades, didn't you think that maybe, just maybe, you should have told us you were alive? Michael looked at her with tormented eyes. Every day, he said quietly. Every day I thought about it. But the longer time went on, the more impossible it became. How could I just show up after a year, after 5 years, after 10? What would I say? Sorry, I was hiding, but I'm better now. You could have tried, Rebecca insisted. Mom would have forgiven you. She loved you so much, Michael. She never stopped hoping you'd come home. Michael covered his face with his hands. I know, he said, his voice breaking. I saw her obituary in the paper. 7 years ago, pancreatic cancer. I was in Cedar Rapids that day, doing a side job for a contractor on the East Bank. I grabbed a copy of the Gazette from a newspaper box. There she was, on the obituary page. Catherine Marie Harrison, 63, survived by her husband Thomas and daughter Rebecca. Did you go to the funeral? Rebecca asked, though she already knew the answer. I stayed in the back, Michael admitted. Wore a hat, sunglasses. Nobody recognized me. I saw you, Becca, saw how broken you were. I saw Dad, how empty he looked, and I knew I had done that. I turned my father into a shell and broke my little sister. All because I was too much of a coward to face the consequences of my own choices. Rebecca felt anger boiling inside her. You're right, she said coldly. You were a coward. You still are. You hide here on the riverbank, pretending you're paying some kind of penance, but really you're just running away. Again. Michael stood abruptly. You think this is easy? He shouted, his voice echoing along the shore. You think I chose this life? I have nothing, Rebecca. Nothing. No home, no family, no future. I exist. That's all. I survive one day at a time, and I live with the guilt of what I did every waking moment. Then change it, Rebecca shouted back. Stop being a victim and change it. You have a sister standing right here in front of you. You have a nephew you saved. You have a chance to have a family again, but only if you stop running. They stared at each other, both breathing heavily, years of pain and anger finally bubbling to the surface. The river ran behind them, indifferent to the human drama unfolding on its banks. Finally, Michael sank back onto the log. You don't understand, he said quietly. It's not as simple as just deciding to come back. I'm legally dead, Becca. After 7 years, Dad had me declared dead so he could close my accounts, handle my paperwork. I don't exist in any system, no valid social security number, no driver's license, nothing. And even if I could reverse all that legally, there are other complications. What complications? Rebecca asked, sitting beside him. Michael hesitated, clearly debating how much to reveal. Rousseau wasn't my only problem, he finally said. There were other things. Things I did when I was desperate. Things I'm not proud of. What kind of things? Michael looked toward the river. Before I disappeared completely, I committed a few minor crimes. Small thefts, mostly. I'd rob convenience stores, break into cars for quick cash. I was trying to gather money to pay Rousseau, but I obviously never got close. There was a warrant out for me for one of the thefts. Technically, it's still active, I assume, even if it's under the name of a dead man. Rebecca processed that. How many thefts? Michael shrugged. 5, maybe 6. Small convenience stores, gas stations. I wore a mask, never hurt anyone, just took the money and left. But it was still armed robbery. That's a felony, Becca. I could do 10 years in a state prison. You had a gun? Rebecca asked, surprised. Michael shook his head. I used a paintball gun that looked real, but that doesn't matter in the eyes of the law. Robbery is robbery. Rebecca was silent for a long moment. Her brother wasn't just a fugitive from gambling debts. He was a criminal. She tried to reconcile that with the memory of the Michael she'd known, the 17-year-old boy who taught her how to ride a bike, who defended her from bullies at school, who slept on the floor beside her bed when she had pneumonia and was afraid to sleep alone. How many people know about this? She asked. Michael let out a bitter laugh. Besides you, no one. The police never connected me to the robberies. They had video footage from security cameras, but it was grainy, and I was always masked. They knew it was a young man, about 6 feet tall, but that was it. Then Michael Harrison disappeared. The robbery stopped, and I guess they just moved on to other cases. That was 20 years ago, Rebecca pointed out. The statute of limitations. Michael shook his head. There's no statute of limitations for felonies in Iowa, and armed robbery is definitely a felony. If I resurface, if I declare myself alive, there's a chance someone connects the dots. A young man committing robberies in Cedar Rapids? A young man disappearing at the same time. Not hard math. So you're going to hide here forever? Rebecca asked. Just to avoid the possibility of being arrested. Michael looked at her. I saved 9 lives during this flood, Becca. 9 people who would have died if I hadn't been there. If I didn't know the river like I do. Your son was one of them. Doesn't that count for something? Haven't I paid my debt in some way? Rebecca considered that. Ethan is alive because of you, she said softly. I can never repay that. But paying your debt to society and paying your debt to our family are different things. What do you want from me? Michael asked, sounding genuinely lost. Rebecca looked at the makeshift grave, at the faded photo of a family that no longer existed. I want you to know your nephew properly, she said. I want you to be part of his life. And I want to understand who you are now, not who you were 20 years ago. Michael looked at her, hope and fear mingling in his eyes. What if I can't be the brother you remember? I don't expect you to be, Rebecca said. We've both changed. Michael, but maybe we can figure out who we are now, together. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the river flow. The sun was beginning to set, casting orange and pink tones across the sky. In the distance, Rebecca could hear the sound of helicopters still involved in recovery efforts. I used to come here when I was a kid, Michael said suddenly. Dad would bring me fishing. You were too young, you don't remember. But every summer, he and I would come to this exact spot and spend the day catching bass and catfish. Rebecca smiled. I remember the photos. You'd always come back sunburned and reeking of fish. Mom made you shower with the garden hose before letting you inside. Michael laughed. A genuine sound Rebecca hadn't heard in decades. I'd forgotten that. God, she'd get so mad. But there was always a hot dinner waiting after I cleaned up. Fried fish, potato salad, cornbread. Her recipe's still in my kitchen, Rebecca said. Or was. I don't know what's left of the house after the flood. We haven't been able to go back yet to assess the damage. I could go with you, Michael offered hesitantly. When you're ready to go back, I could help with the cleanup. See what can be saved. Rebecca looked at her brother, seeing the offer for what it was, a reaching out. A tentative first step back toward a connection long severed. She nodded. I'd like that. They talked until twilight swallowed them, sharing memories, filling in gaps, carefully steering around the most painful topics. Rebecca told Michael about her life, about how she'd met James in college, about her career as a kindergarten teacher at Taylor Elementary, about the joy and terror of raising Ethan. Michael told her about his years on the margins, about brutal winters spent sleeping in his tent with 3 sleeping bags, about the quiet summers when the river was calm and he could pretend he was just a man on an extended camping trip. When Rebecca finally stood to leave, night had fully fallen. Michael walked her back to the car, holding a flashlight to light the way. At the roadside, they hesitated. I'll come back, Rebecca promised, and when I do, I'll bring Ethan. He should meet his uncle properly. Michael quickly wiped his eyes. I'd like that, he said hoarsely. Rebecca hugged him, then the first physical contact they'd shared in 2 decades. Michael stiffened for a moment, then returned the embrace, holding her tightly, as if afraid she might disappear if he let go. Thank you for not giving up on me, he whispered. You're my brother, Rebecca said simply. I'll never give up on you. As she drove back to Hiawatha, the headlights cutting through the darkness of rural Iowa, Rebecca felt something shift inside her. The anger was still there, and the pain, and the confusion, but there was also something new. Hope that broken families could be mended. Hope that past mistakes didn't have to define the future. Hope that sometimes, amid destruction, something precious could be found again. 3 weeks had passed since the flood, and Cedar Rapids was slowly coming back to life. The water had receded, leaving behind a layer of brown mud and debris that would take months to fully clear. First Avenue was still closed, but Interstate 380 had reopened, allowing businesses to resume operations. James's dealership had lost 70% of its inventory, but insurance had begun processing claims, and new vehicles were being shipped from distributors in Des Moines and Omaha. Rebecca had returned to the house on 10th Avenue for the first time the previous week. The site had been devastating. The first floor was completely destroyed. Hardwood floors warped beyond repair, drywall swollen and moldy, furniture ruined. The smell of mold and sewage was oppressive. The insurance company had sent an adjuster who spent 3 hours documenting the damage before declaring the house a total loss. They recommended complete demolition and rebuilding, but Rebecca wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. That house contained far more than just her belongings. It held memories of her childhood, her teenage years, her parents. It held the history of a family that had known both joy and tragedy. She wanted to save what she could. It was James who suggested asking Michael for help. They were sitting at Margaret's dining table, Ethan already asleep upstairs. When he mentioned it, he knows construction, right? James said, and he obviously has time. Maybe he could help assess what's salvageable before we make any final decisions. Rebecca looked at her husband with gratitude. James had been surprisingly supportive about the whole situation with Michael. She'd expected judgment, maybe even demands that she go to the police. But James understood that the situation was complicated, that there were no easy answers. He also understood that Rebecca needed time to process everything before making any major decisions. So Rebecca called Michael, or rather, she drove back to Bertram. Since Michael didn't have a phone, she found him repairing his tent, which had been damaged by a fallen branch during a recent storm. When she asked if he'd help with the house, his face lit up in a way that made him look years younger. "I'd love to," he said immediately. "When do we start?" They started the next day. Michael showed up at the 10th Avenue house at 7 a.m., wearing faded jeans, worn work boots, and a flannel shirt that had seen better days. He'd shaved, Rebecca noticed, not completely, but trimmed into something more presentable. And he'd cut his hair, though clearly by himself, resulting in an uneven style that could generously be called rustic. James was there too, having taken the day off work. The two men greeted each other with an awkward handshake, assessing one another with the cautious respect men often show when meeting for the first time under unusual circumstances. But soon they were working side by side, tearing out damaged drywall, cutting ruined carpet, hauling debris to a large dumpster Rebecca had rented. Ethan watched from a safe distance, still uneasy around so much water-related destruction. Rebecca kept him entertained with a tablet loaded with educational games. But the boy kept glancing at Michael with curiosity. He remembered the man from the riverbank, the man who'd saved him, but he didn't fully understand the relationship. At lunch, they took a break. Rebecca had packed roast beef sandwiches and brought a cooler of soda. They sat on the curb in front of the house, watching cleanup crews work on nearby homes. The entire neighborhood looked like a construction zone, with dumpsters in every driveway and the sound of saws and hammers echoing down the street. "Uncle Michael," Ethan said suddenly, testing the words. Rebecca had told her son about Michael's identity a few days earlier, trying to explain it in terms an 8-year-old could grasp. "You really lived in a tent the whole time?" Michael nodded, chewing his sandwich. "For a long time, yeah. Doesn't that get cold in winter?" "Very cold," Michael admitted, "but you adapt. Lots of blankets, a good sleeping bag, and a campfire when it's safe to have one." Ethan considered that. "I think it'd be cool, like camping forever." Michael smiled, but Rebecca saw the sadness in his eyes. "It's a little different from camping, buddy. Camping's fun because you know you're going home afterward. When it's your home, it loses some of the magic." "Why don't you get a real house?" Ethan asked with the bluntness of children. Michael looked at Rebecca for guidance on how much to share. She nodded subtly. "It's complicated," Michael told Ethan, "but I'm working on it. You could live with us," Ethan offered. "We have an extra room at Grandma Margaret's house." "That's very kind, champ," Michael said, clearly touched. "But I think Grandma Margaret's already being generous enough, letting you stay there." James spoke up. "Actually," he said slowly, "we've been talking about that, Rebecca and me, about everyone's living situation." Rebecca looked at her husband, surprised. They'd discussed finances, insurance, rebuilding options, but she hadn't known he'd thought of something specific regarding Michael. James turned to Michael. "Rebuilding this house will take months, easily, maybe a year or more if we do it right, and we don't have anywhere to stay while it's being done. Not permanently. My mom's house is generous, but she needs her space, and we need ours." "Where are you going with this?" Michael asked. James took a deep breath. "There's a trailer on our property. Came with the package when we bought Rebecca's parents' house. It was their temporary home, while the main house was originally being built in the 50s. It's in rough shape, but the structure's solid. It's on high ground, completely untouched by the flood." He paused. "If you helped fix it up, you could stay there rent-free. It'd be a real base for you instead of a tent, and you'd be close enough to help with rebuilding the main house." Michael looked between James and Rebecca, disbelief clear on his face. "You're serious?" "Completely," James said. "Look, I know there's a lot of history here, a lot of complicated stuff, but Rebecca told me about the legal complications. Until you sort that out, you need a place. And frankly, we could use the help. You know construction, you're clearly hardworking, and Ethan obviously likes you." "I like you, Uncle Michael," Ethan confirmed brightly. "You're cool." Rebecca felt tears prick her eyes. She hadn't asked James to do this. He'd thought of it himself, decided it was the right thing to do. She remembered why she'd fallen in love with this man 10 years ago. His fundamental kindness, his willingness to see the best in people, his belief that everyone deserved a second chance. Michael cleared his throat, clearly moved. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Rebecca said gently. "Say you'll accept the help. Say you'll stop living like a hermit and rejoin the world. Even if it's just a small step." Michael looked at the house behind them, at the damaged structure that held so many memories. Then he looked at the small group sitting on the curb with him. His sister, his brother-in-law, his nephew, a family. If he had the courage to accept it, yes, he finally said. "Yes, I'll take it, thank you." The following week settled into a rhythm. Michael would leave his camp early. Arriving at the property by 7 a.m., he and James worked on the main house until noon, then shifted their efforts to the trailer. Rebecca helped when she could, but most of the time she looked after Ethan, who had started seeing a therapist twice a week to deal with the trauma of the flood. The trailer was worse than anyone had realized. The roof leaked in 3 places. The plumbing was completely corroded. The electrical wiring was so old it was a fire hazard waiting to happen. But Michael worked tirelessly, often continuing after James left, laboring under floodlights until 10 or 11 at night. Rebecca watched the transformation with awe. Michael was a skilled worker, his hands moving confidently as he replaced rotten beams, rewired circuits, installed new plumbing. He knew construction inside and out, knowledge clearly gained through years of odd jobs and necessity. She began bringing him dinner on nights he worked late, homemade stew, thick sandwiches, sometimes pizza from a local restaurant that had reopened. They'd sit on the trailer steps, eating and talking as the stars came out above them. It was during one of those evenings that Michael finally told her more about his missing years. "I spent the first 2 years just surviving," he said. "Took odd jobs for cash, slept in shelters when it got too cold. I moved around a lot, never staying in one place long enough for people to ask too many questions." He took a sip of the beer Rebecca had brought. "But around year 3, I started to settle more. I realized I knew the Cedar River better than most people. I'd grown up fishing in it, camping along it, so I started living along it. I'd set up temporary camps, stay a few months, then move to a new spot when needed." "Why the river?" Rebecca asked. Michael shrugged. "Peace, I guess, and anonymity. The people who live along the river, fishermen, riverbank residents, they respect privacy. Nobody asks many questions. You're just another guy who likes being near the water." He looked toward the Cedar River running behind the property, barely visible in the darkness. "And I learned things. I learned to read the water, to know when a storm was coming, when the river would rise. I learned which plants were edible, how to fish year-round, how to find clean water. I learned to survive." "But that's not living," Rebecca said softly. "No," Michael agreed. "It's not, but when you've done what I've done, when you've hurt the people I've hurt, survival feels like all you deserve." They were silent for a moment. Then Rebecca asked the question that had been on her mind. "You never married, never had anyone?" Michael smiled sadly. "There was someone once, about 12 years ago. Her name was Lisa. She worked at a cafe in Waterloo. We met when I was doing construction work there. She didn't know about my past, didn't know I was basically living off the grid. She just thought I was a quiet guy who preferred manual work to office jobs." "What happened?" Rebecca asked. Michael sighed. "She wanted to get married, wanted to start a family, and I wanted that too, more than anything. But how could I? Couldn't legally marry. I couldn't have children who'd never have a proper father, who'd live with the consequences of my choices." He paused. "So I ended it, told her I wasn't ready, that I never would be. She was devastated, and I went back to the river." Rebecca touched her brother's arm. "You gave up a lot." Michael shook his head. "It's not sacrifice when it's your fault. It's consequence." Over the following weeks, the trailer slowly transformed. The roof was patched and then completely replaced. New plumbing was installed. The electrical wiring was entirely redone by a licensed electrician James had hired, with Michael doing all the prep work to keep costs low. Windows were replaced. The floor was repaired and polished. Margaret donated some furniture from her basement: a single bed, a kitchen table with 2 chairs, a worn but comfortable armchair. Rebecca brought sheets, towels, dishes, and pots. James contributed a small television and an old DVD player. 6 weeks after the flood, Michael moved in. It was a modest event. He owned nothing beyond what he carried in his camping backpack: some clothes, a faded photo of his family, a worn-out journal he had kept over the years. But when he crossed the door of the refurbished trailer for the first time, Rebecca saw tears in his eyes. "It's my first real home in 20 years, he said hoarsely. "Thank you for all of this." Ethan had insisted on helping his uncle get settled. The boy ran through the small structure, thrilled by every detail. "Look, Uncle Michael, you have a real microwave, and a shower. And look how many drawers." Michael knelt beside his nephew. "Want to know a secret?" he whispered loudly enough for Rebecca to hear. "I barely remember how to use a microwave. You might have to teach me." Ethan took the responsibility seriously, spending 15 minutes explaining the various buttons and settings while Michael listened intently, asking serious questions that made the boy feel important. Watching them together, Rebecca felt something settle in her chest. Ethan needed positive male figures in his life, especially now as he dealt with the trauma of the flood. James was a good father but had been working long hours trying to save his job. Michael, for all his flaws and past mistakes, was kind, patient, and clearly loved his nephew. That night, they celebrated with a simple meal in the trailer. Rebecca had made lasagna, her mother's recipe, which involved 3 types of cheese and homemade sauce that simmered for hours. It had been Michael's favorite food when they were children. She hoped he remembered. When he took the first bite, Michael closed his eyes. "Mom used to make this," he said quietly, "every Sunday after church. She taught me the recipe before she got too sick to cook," Rebecca said. "I make it for Ethan on his birthday every year." Michael looked at her with gratitude and sorrow mingled. He opened his mouth to say something, then closed it again, unable to find the words. But Rebecca understood. Some things didn't need words. After dinner, James took Ethan back to Margaret's house, leaving Rebecca and Michael alone to clean up. They washed dishes side by side in the small kitchen sink, falling into a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural considering the years they'd been apart. "I talked to a lawyer," Rebecca said suddenly, "about your situation." Michael stopped scrubbing the plate he was holding. "What?" "Don't worry," Rebecca said quickly. "I didn't give any specific details. I just presented a hypothetical situation. Someone declared dead, wanting to be declared alive again. Possible criminal complications from the past." "What did he say?" Michael asked, his voice tense. Rebecca dried a plate before answering. "He said it's complicated but not impossible. You'd have to hire an attorney, petition the court to reverse the death declaration. There'd be an investigation to confirm your identity. And yes, if there are outstanding warrants, they'd resurface." Michael leaned against the counter. "So it's hopeless?" "Not necessarily," Rebecca said. "The lawyer mentioned something called a plea agreement. If you came forward voluntarily, explained the circumstances, showed that you'd rebuilt your life, there's a chance the prosecutor might offer a deal, especially considering how much time has passed, and the fact that you saved lives during the flood." Michael shook his head. "Or they throw me in prison for 10 years. "It's possible," Rebecca admitted. "But living the way you are now, always looking over your shoulder, never being able to have a real life, that's a prison too. Just one you built yourself." Michael rubbed his face with his hands. "I need to think about it." "Of course," Rebecca said. "Just know that whatever you decide, I'll be here. We'll be here. You're not alone anymore." Michael looked at his sister, this woman who had every right to hate him but instead chose to forgive him, help him, give him a chance to rebuild. "I don't deserve you," he said. "Probably not," Rebecca agreed with a small smile. "But family isn't about deserving, it's just about showing up." The following months brought subtle changes. Michael continued working on the main house during the day, but at night he began doing other things. He helped Ethan with his homework, taught the boy how to identify different kinds of fish, took him on walks along the river. Ethan's therapy sessions were going well, and the therapist mentioned that having a stable, supportive male figure in his life was significantly helping his recovery. Michael also began going out more in public. At first he was nervous, convinced someone would recognize him, that the police would show up to arrest him. But Cedar Rapids had grown considerably in 20 years. Most people who might have recognized him had moved away or forgotten what he looked like, and those who thought they saw a resemblance to the young man who'd gone missing in the 2000s dismissed it as coincidence. After all, Michael Harrison was dead. Rebecca watched her brother slowly come back to life with quiet satisfaction. He still had bad days when the weight of his choices seemed to crush him, but there were also good days. Days when he laughed easily, when he seemed almost relaxed, when she could glimpse the brother she'd known before everything fell apart. It was on one of those good nights, 3 months after the flood, that Michael made a decision. They were sitting on the small deck Michael had built behind his trailer, watching the sun set over the river. Ethan was chasing fireflies in the grass, his laughter carrying through the evening air. "I'm going to do it," Michael said suddenly. "I'm going to turn myself in." Rebecca looked at him, surprised. "Are you sure?" Michael nodded, watching Ethan. "I can't live half a life anymore. Not when there's a chance, even a small one, that I could have a real one." He looked at Rebecca. "You were right. This is a prison, and I built it myself. It's time to either escape it or officially accept the consequences." "What?" Rebecca asked. Michael took a deep breath. "Soon, maybe next week. I need to get things ready, figure out what I'm going to say. But soon." Rebecca took her brother's hand. "I'll go with you. Whatever happens, you won't face it alone." Michael squeezed her hand. "Thank you, Becca, for everything. For not giving up on me. For giving me a reason to try again." "You saved my son," Rebecca said simply. "You gave me back my brother. We're even." But they both knew it wasn't that simple. Family never was. Love and forgiveness and redemption were messy, complicated processes that didn't follow straight lines or tidy timelines. All they could do was take one step at a time, and hopefully, those steps would lead them toward something like healing. The Cedar Rapids Police Department was a modern brick building on First Avenue, ironically located just 3 blocks from the Harrisons' childhood home. Michael stood outside, his hands trembling slightly as he looked at the glass entrance. Rebecca stood beside him, her presence a silent anchor. "You don't have to do this," she said for the 10th time that morning. "There's still time to turn back." Michael shook his head. "No, it's past time. 20 years past time." They had spent the previous week preparing. Rebecca had hired a criminal defense attorney named David Chen, a man in his 40s with a reputation for handling tough cases and securing favorable deals. Chen had met with Michael 3 times, documenting his story, gathering proof of his identity, building a case for why the prosecutor should show leniency. Chen had also discreetly contacted the Linn County District Attorney's office, preparing them for what was coming. A man declared dead 17 years ago was about to resurface. There would be many questions, lots of paperwork, and yes, likely criminal charges, but Chen was optimistic they could negotiate something reasonable. James had taken the day off work to stay with Ethan. They didn't want the boy present for what was about to happen. Rebecca had explained to Ethan that Uncle Michael needed to fix some things from a long time ago, that he might have to go away for a while, but that everything would be okay in the end. Ethan had hugged Michael tightly that morning, making him promise he'd come back. "I promise, buddy," Michael had said, hoping it was a promise he could keep. Now, standing before the station, Michael took a deep breath. "Ready?" Rebecca asked. "As ready as I'll ever be." They walked in together. The police station lobby was functional but welcoming, with posters about community, safety, and photos of officers at outreach events. A receptionist behind a bulletproof glass window looked up as they approached. "Can I help you?" Rebecca spoke before Michael could. "We're here to see Detective Sarah Martinez. She's expecting us." The receptionist checked her computer names. Rebecca Harrison and Michael Harrison. If the receptionist recognized the second name as that of a man declared dead, she didn't show it. "Please have a seat. Someone will be out shortly." They sat in uncomfortable plastic chairs. Michael, unable to stay still, his leg bounced nervously, his hands opening and closing repeatedly. Rebecca placed a hand on his knee. "Breathe," she said softly. "Just breathe." 5 minutes later, a door opened and a woman wearing jeans and a black leather jacket entered the lobby. She was around 40, with dark hair pulled into a ponytail and sharp eyes that immediately assessed Michael. "Michael Harrison?" she asked. Michael stood. "Yes, Detective Sarah Martinez. Please come with me." "You too, Ms. Harrison." They followed Martinez down a hallway into a small interrogation room. It wasn't the stereotypical intimidating kind from movies. This one was friendlier, with a wooden table, comfortable chairs, and no visible two-way mirror. David Chen was already there, a thick folder of documents in front of him. Martinez sat across the table. "So," she began, "let's talk about the last 20 years. The next 3 hours were exhausting. Michael told his story from beginning to end, leaving nothing out: the gambling, the debts, Vincent Rousseau, the robberies, the decision to disappear. Martinez recorded everything, occasionally asking clarifying questions. Chen intervened when necessary, ensuring Michael's rights were protected. When Michael finished, Martinez leaned back in her chair. "That's quite a story," she said. "And you're telling me you lived less than 50 miles from Cedar Rapids this whole time?" "Most of it," Michael confirmed. "Mainly along the Cedar River." Martinez flipped through several pages in a file she'd brought. "We have 6 unsolved armed robbery cases from 2004 and 2005. Convenience stores, gas stations. The suspect always wore a mask, always used what witnesses described as a realistic-looking weapon. The robberies stopped abruptly in June 2005, around the same time you disappeared." "That was me," Michael said. "All 6, and you're willing to formally confess to those crimes?" Chen leaned forward. "My client is willing to cooperate fully, including formal confessions." In exchange for appropriate consideration given the unique circumstances, Martinez nodded. "I'll need to take him into custody now. There'll be a formal arraignment, a bail hearing. The process follows certain procedures." "How long?" Rebecca asked, her voice tight. Martinez looked at her with something like sympathy. "But depends on the judge, the prosecutor, many factors. But honestly, with a good lawyer, mitigating circumstances, the fact that he's coming in voluntarily, after 2 decades, and especially considering the lives he saved during the recent flood, I'd be surprised if he got more than 1 to 2 years. Possibly probation." Chen nodded in agreement. "That's my assessment too, and I'll fight for every day." Michael looked at Rebecca. 1 to 2 years. He could handle 1 to 2 years. After 2 decades of self-imposed exile, of living like a ghost, even prison seemed bearable if it meant he could finally clear his name, finally have a real life. "It's okay," he told Rebecca. "I can do this." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. "I'll visit every week. And Ethan too, if you want." "I'd like that," Michael said, his own voice breaking. Martinez stood. "I need to formally place you under arrest now, Mr. Harrison. Please stand and put your hands behind your back." Michael did so, feeling the cold handcuffs click around his wrists. It was a surreal feeling, being arrested after so long living outside the law, but it was also almost a relief. No more hiding, no more looking over his shoulder. The consequences he'd run from for 20 years had finally caught up to him, and he would face them. Martinez led him through the station to the processing area. Rebecca followed as far as she was allowed, then had to stop at a line marked on the floor. Michael turned to look at her one last time before being taken away. "I'll be back," he said. "I promise, Becca. This time I'll come back." "I know," Rebecca said through tears. "I believe you." The following weeks were a whirlwind of legal procedures. Michael was formally charged with 6 counts of armed robbery. Bail was set at $50,000, which Rebecca and James managed to pay by putting up the 10th Avenue property as collateral. Michael was released under strict conditions. He had to wear an ankle monitor, check in regularly with a parole officer, and remain within Lynn County. The story hit the media almost immediately. Asterisk man reemerges after 20 years presumed dead. Asterisk declared the Asterisk Cedar Rapids Gazette. Asterisk Local news stations picked it up, and soon reporters were showing up at the door, wanting interviews. Rebecca turned them all away. This was a family matter, not public entertainment. But not all the media attention was negative. When it came out that Michael had saved 9 people during the flood, including his own nephew, the narrative began to shift. Letters started coming in. Some of the people he'd saved spoke up, defending him, urging the prosecutor to show mercy. A 73-year-old man named Robert Chen wrote a passionate editorial in the Gazette, about how Michael had rescued him from the roof of his house, how he'd be dead if not for this man's bravery. The prosecutor, a woman named Jennifer Walsh, was known for being tough but fair. She and David Chen negotiated for weeks. Walsh wanted prison time. Chen argued for probation. They finally reached a middle ground. 6 months in Lynn County Jail, followed by 5 years of probation. Michael would have to complete 1,000 hours of community service, undergo counseling, and remain employed. If he successfully completed everything, his charges would be reduced to misdemeanors, and he could eventually have his record sealed. It was more than Chen had hoped for, less than Walsh wanted. Michael accepted the deal without hesitation. Sentencing took place on a Tuesday in October, 6 months after the flood that had changed everything. The courtroom was surprisingly full. Rebecca was there, of course, sitting in the front row with James beside her. To her surprise, Margaret also came, having developed genuine affection for Michael during the months he'd lived on her property. Ethan was at school, but had made Rebecca promise to tell Uncle Michael that he loved him. 3 of the people Michael had saved during the flood were also present, wanting to show support. And in the back of the courtroom, almost hidden, was a man in his 60s with gray hair and a lined face. Rebecca didn't recognize him at first. Only when the man met her eyes and gave a slight nod did she realize. Vincent Russo, the loan shark who had started all of this 2 decades ago. She felt anger rising, but before she could do anything, Russo stood and left the courtroom. He had come, she realized, not to threaten or intimidate, but simply to witness, to see what had become of the young man who had run from his debts so long ago. The judge, a man in his early 50s named Thomas Bradley, heard impact statements from several of Michael's robbery victims. Most were understanding, noting that the crime had occurred 2 decades earlier, that no one had been hurt, that Michael had clearly changed. One woman, the owner of a convenience store that had been robbed, was less forgiving. She still had nightmares, she said. She still jumped when a customer walked in wearing a hoodie. Michael listened without defending himself, accepting every word as his due. Finally, Judge Bradley spoke. "Mr. Harrison," he began, "you committed serious crimes. You terrorized innocent people. You then fled from justice for 2 decades. These are not minor offenses." He paused. "However, you also did something extraordinary. During one of the worst floods in this region's history, you repeatedly risked your own life to save others. You sought no recognition, no reward. You simply did what was right." The judge looked directly at Michael. "Justice is not vengeance, Mr. Harrison. It is the balancing of scales. It is acknowledging both the wrong that was done and the good. In this case, considering the unique circumstances, I accept a negotiated plea. 6 months followed by 5 years of probation." He struck the gavel. "But let me be clear, Mr. Harrison, this is your second chance. Your only second chance. If you violate the terms of your probation in any way, you will serve the maximum sentence. Do I make myself understood?" Michael nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." "Thank you, Your Honor." Judge Bradley smiled slightly. "Welcome back to the land of the living, Mr. Harrison. Use this chance wisely." Michael was taken to begin his sentence immediately. But before leaving the courtroom, he turned to look at Rebecca. She was crying but smiling. 6 months, only 6 months, and then he would be home. Those 6 months passed slowly. Rebecca visited him every week, usually bringing Ethan along. The boy had initially been confused about why Uncle Michael was in prison, but Rebecca explained as best she could. "Sometimes adults make mistakes," she said, "and sometimes they have to face the consequences, but that doesn't mean we stop loving them." Michael used his time wisely. He enrolled in educational programs, earning his GED, then starting correspondence courses from a community college. He attended counseling, working through decades of guilt and self-inflicted trauma. He read voraciously, devouring books on everything from construction to philosophy. And he wrote letters. Long detailed letters to Rebecca, to James, to Ethan. Letters about his childhood memories, his regrets, his plans for the future. Rebecca kept them all in a shoebox, a record of her brother's transformation. When Michael was finally released on a cold April morning in 2026, almost exactly 1 year after the flood, Rebecca was waiting outside the prison gates. She wasn't alone. James was there, and Margaret, and Ethan, who held a large sign that read, "Welcome home, Uncle Michael." Drawn with colorful markers, Michael stepped out wearing the clothes he had worn when he turned himself in, carrying a small bag of belongings. He blinked in the spring sunlight, then saw his family waiting. His face broke into a smile Rebecca hadn't seen in years, not the sad, guilt-laden smile of the past months, but a genuine, joyful, unburdened one. Ethan ran to him first, slamming into Michael's legs with enough force to nearly knock him over. You're home, Michael lifted his nephew, spinning him around in a circle. I'm home, he confirmed, and I'm never leaving again. Rebecca reached them, pulling Michael into a tight embrace. Welcome back, she whispered. It's good to be back, Michael replied. It's good to be alive again. They drove together back to the 10th Avenue property. The main house was still under construction, but progress had been substantial. The first floor was completely rebuilt, with new hardwood floors, freshly painted white walls, and gleaming new appliances in the kitchen. The second floor, which had largely escaped the flood, had been renovated to match. It was almost ready for them to move back in. Michael's trailer was also there, waiting for him. Rebecca and James had kept it, making sure it stayed in good condition. It was small and humble, but it was his real place, with a real address, where he could begin rebuilding a real life. That night, they celebrated with a big family dinner at Margaret's house. She had cooked roast beef with all the trimmings, and there was chocolate cake for dessert. Ethan chattered non-stop through the meal, telling Uncle Michael everything about school, his friends, the new puppy his parents had promised he could have once they moved back into the house. Michael listened to it all, asking questions, laughing in all the right places, simply savoring being part of a family again. He looked around the table at these faces, these people who had forgiven him, who had given him a chance when he didn't deserve one, his sister, who never gave up on him, his brother-in-law who treated him with kindness when he could have shown judgment, his mother-in-law who welcomed him onto her property without hesitation, and his nephew who loved him with the simple, unconditional acceptance of a child. I want to say something, Michael announced, standing slightly. The table grew quiet. I spent 20 years running, he began, 20 years hiding, convinced I'd destroyed any chance at happiness, at family, at belonging. He paused, his voice thick with emotion. But you've shown me it's never too late. It's never too late to come home, to ask forgiveness, to try to make things right. He looked directly at Rebecca. Becca, you gave me my life back. You had every right to turn your back on me, to report me, to let me keep suffering alone for my choices. But you didn't. You chose mercy. You chose family, and I'll never, ever forget that. Rebecca wiped her eyes. You saved my son, she said. How could I do any less? Michael shook his head. It wasn't just about Ethan. You saved me too. You saved me from myself. He turned to James. Man, you gave me a home when I had none. You worked beside me, treated me like a brother, when I was basically a stranger. Thank you for trusting me, for believing I could change. James nodded, clearly too emotional to speak. Michael knelt beside Ethan's chair. And you, champ? You remind me why it's worth fighting, why it's worth trying. You're brave, kind, and full of life. And I promise I'll be the best uncle I can be for you, always. Ethan threw his arms around Michael's neck. You already are the best uncle, he said seriously. You saved me from the water. You're my hero. Michael hugged his nephew tightly, trying not to let everyone see the tears streaming down his face. But everyone saw and no one minded. Margaret raised her wine glass. 2 family, she said. 2 second chances. 2 coming home. Everyone lifted their glasses, echoing the toast. To family, to second chances, to coming home. The following months brought a new normal. Rebecca, James, and Ethan moved back into the rebuilt 10th Avenue house in June. The home was unrecognizable from its flood-damaged form, bright and new, yet Rebecca had made sure to preserve elements of the original, the window frames her father had installed, the stone fireplace in the living room where her family had gathered on winter nights, the old oak tree in the front yard where she and Michael had built a treehouse as kids. Michael began his community service, working with Habitat for Humanity, helping rebuild homes for families who had lost everything in the flood. He found deep purpose in the work, a way to give back, to turn his skills into something that helped others. His supervisor was so impressed with his work that he offered Michael a permanent position once his service was complete. He also got a part-time job at a local hardware store on Collins Road. The owner, a Vietnam veteran named Frank Morrison, didn't care about Michael's past. Everyone deserves a chance to start over, Frank said simply, and you clearly know your tools. Michael's counseling sessions continued. Even after his release, he worked with a therapist twice a month, processing the trauma of 2 decades of isolation, dealing with the guilt that still haunted him at times, learning to forgive himself the way his family had forgiven him. And slowly, step by step, Michael built a life. A real life, not the ghostly existence he'd maintained for so long. He shopped for groceries, paid taxes, had a functioning social security number, and a valid driver's license. He was a citizen again, a person again. Ethan became his constant shadow. Every afternoon after school, the boy would come to Michael's trailer, and they would spend hours together. Michael taught Ethan carpentry, how to use a hammer properly, how to measure and cut wood, how to build things with his hands. They fished on the Cedar River, just as Michael's father had done with him decades before. They hiked along the riverbanks, Michael identifying plants and wildlife, sharing the knowledge he'd gained during his years living close to the land. Rebecca watched their relationship blossom with joy. Ethan had changed so much since the flood. The nightmares had faded. He no longer panicked near water. His therapist credited much of his recovery to Michael's steady presence to this figure who had once saved him and continued to make him feel safe. On the first anniversary of the flood, March 2026, Cedar Rapids held a memorial service for the 18 people who had lost their lives in the disaster. Rebecca, James, Ethan, and Michael attended together. The mayor spoke about resilience, about community, about how Cedar Rapids had risen stronger. There was a newly dedicated monument in green square parkatine trees planted in a circle, each with a plaque bearing a victim's name. But there was also a second memorial, a large mural painted on the side of a building near First Avenue, depicting the flood and its aftermath. Within that mural, the artist had included anonymous figures, ordinary people doing extraordinary things. A man in a kayak pulling someone from the water, neighbors helping neighbors, strangers becoming heroes. Michael stood before that mural for a long time, staring at the figure in the kayak. That could be anyone, he said quietly, but Rebecca knew who it was, and she knew Michael did too. You made a difference, she said, standing beside him. You saved lives, that matters, Michael. No matter what else, that matters. Michael nodded slowly. I spent so long punishing myself for what I did wrong, he said. I think it's time to start giving myself some credit for what I did right, too. I think so, Rebecca agreed. That evening, back at the 10th Avenue house, Michael helped Rebecca plant roses in the front yard. They were red tea hybrids, the exact variety their mother had loved. Rebecca had ordered 12 bushes from a nursery in Iowa City, determined to rebuild the rose garden that had been destroyed by the flood. They worked in comfortable silence, digging holes in the soft spring soil, mixing compost, carefully planting each bush. Ethan helped, his small hands getting dirty as he enthusiastically threw soil everywhere. When the last rose was planted, Rebecca stood and looked at the garden. She could imagine how it would look in a few months when the roses bloomed a sea of red against a bright white house, exactly as she remembered from her childhood. Mom would have liked this, Michael said softly, clearly thinking the same thing. Yes, Rebecca agreed. She would have. Ethan was now running across the yard, chasing a rabbit that had dared to wander into his territory. His laughter echoed through the neighborhood, a sound of pure joy. Michael watched his nephew with a smile. You know, he said, I spent 20 years convinced I didn't deserve this. Family, happiness, belonging. I thought my punishment was to be alone forever. And now? Rebecca asked. Now I realize it's not about deserving. Michael said, it's about accepting. It's about letting people love you, even when you don't love yourself. It's about forgiving yourself and moving forward. He looked at Rebecca. You taught me that. You and Ethan and James. You showed me it's possible to start over, no matter how far you've gone astray. That it's never too late to come home. Rebecca took her brother's hand. You're home now, she said simply. Finally, you're home. They stood together as the sun set, watching Ethan play, listening to the sounds of the neighborhood coming back to life around them. Children laughing, lawnmowers buzzing, a dog barking somewhere nearby. The sounds of normalcy, of ordinary life, of home. For Michael, who had spent so many years isolated, those sounds were a symphony, a reminder that he was no longer alone, no longer a ghost living on the edges of society. He was part of something again. Part of a family, part of a community, part of the human tapestry of connection and love. The flood had taken so much, it had destroyed homes, devastated communities, claimed lives. But it had also given something back. It had returned a brother. It had reunited a family. It had shown that even in the worst destruction, there was the possibility of renewal, of rebuilding, of redemption. Weeks turned into months, and months into years. Michael completed his community service with distinction. His probation period passed without incident. His charges were reduced exactly as promised, and eventually his record was sealed. He was no longer a fugitive felon. He was simply Michael Harrison Carpenter, uncle, brother, respected member of the Cedar Rapids community. He never moved back into a real house. The trailer became his permanent home, and he wouldn't have changed that for anything. It was small, but it was enough. And more importantly, it sat on his sister's property, keeping him connected to the family that had saved him. In his 30s, Michael began dating again. He met a woman named Angela at a Habitat for Humanity event. She was a widow with 2 teenage daughters, and she didn't care about Michael's past. We all have stories, she said. We all make mistakes. What matters is who we are now. Rebecca liked Angela immediately. She was kind, graceful, and clearly in love with Michael. And Michael, for the first time in decades, seemed genuinely happy, not just content, but happy. The kind of happiness that comes from allowing yourself to be loved, from opening your heart again after years of keeping it shut. When Michael and Angela announced their engagement 2 years later, Rebecca cried tears of joy. The wedding was held in the backyard of the 10th Avenue house, under the oak tree where Michael and Rebecca had played as children. It was a small event, just close family and a few friends, but it was perfect. Ethan was the ring bearer, taking his responsibility with solemn seriousness. He was 13 now, growing into an impressive young man who adored his uncle more than anyone in the world. He planned to study environmental engineering in college, inspired by the years he had spent learning about the Cedar River and its ecosystems with Michael. During the ceremony, as Michael and Angela exchanged vows, Rebecca looked around at the scene. The garden was in full bloom, bright red roses against the green foliage. The house, fully rebuilt, stood beautiful in the June sunlight. Her family, once fractured and then rebuilt, was gathered in celebration, and she thought of her parents, Thomas and Catherine, who had passed away never knowing Michael was alive. Part of her was sad they had missed this, that they had died with broken hearts, never knowing their son had been just a few miles away all along. But another part of her wanted to believe they knew now, that wherever they were, they could see this. See their son finally home, finally happy, finally living the life he was meant to live. See their family reunited, stronger for having been broken and then mended. Life wasn't perfect. There were still scars, still moments when the past cast long shadows. But they had learned to live with those scars, to weave them into their story without letting them define their future. The 2025 flood would always be remembered as one of the worst natural disasters in Iowa's history. But for the Harrison family, it would always be remembered as something else too. As the day they lost almost everything but got back what mattered most. As the day a brother returned from the dead. As the day a broken family began to heal. Years later, when Ethan was in college and Rebecca and James were entering middle age, when Michael and Angela had built a beautiful life together, when the memories of the flood had softened around the edges and become just another part of the family's long story, they still gathered every spring. They gathered on the banks of the Cedar River, at the spot where Michael had once set up his camp so many years before. They would have a picnic, tell stories, remember both what had been lost and what had been found. And as the river flowed beside them, indifferent to the human dramas that had unfolded along its shores, they would remember that families were complex, that forgiveness was possible, that redemption was real. They would remember that sometimes you need to lose everything to discover what truly matters. And they would remember that no matter how far you stray, no matter how many mistakes you make, no matter how long you stay away, home always remains, waiting, forgiving, ready to welcome you back. Because in the end, family isn't about perfection, it's about presence. It's about showing up, even when it's hard. It's about choosing love over judgment, forgiveness over anger, connection over isolation. Michael Harrison had learned that lesson the hard way, but he had learned it. And now, surrounded by people who loved him, living a life he never thought possible, he was finally at peace. The water had taken so much, but it had also given back. And in the end, that was all that mattered. If this story touched your heart, leave your like and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories like this one. Share in the comments. Do you believe it's never too late to start over? That everyone deserves a second chance, no matter what they've done in the past? Your opinion matters to us. And if you know someone who needs to hear a story about forgiveness, about family, about never giving up on the people we love, share this video. Sometimes, a story is all we need to remember that there is always hope, always a way back home. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next story.